right now, I'm going to talk about the Unitarian Universalist principles. We talked about the sources some yesterday, or last Sunday. Now we're going to talk about the principles. Last week I talked about the danger or the problem, or whatever you want to call it, with having so many different sources, religious sources, tradition sources, sources by which we find truth and meaning that aren't all the same. And so we come together and we have this group of people who are wildly different from each other. And somehow we find a unifying factor in all that. And are able to say we respect the religious traditions, the humanistic traditions, the nature-centered traditions, and still come together and love each other and listen to each other. So that's the sources, and the danger, of course, is that people will go off and focus on just one of these and not necessarily want to come here and hear from all these other perspectives. And that does happen sometimes. But today we're talking about things that unify us, the principles. Now the principles are up here. They're also in your hymn book, unless you have one of the older hymn books in which the last one isn't up there, because that one was added later. But I'm going to give you a little bit of history and also show you how it's evolved over time, because these aren't the principles of 1961, when the Unitarians and the Universalists merged to form Unitarian Universalism as we have it today. I want to acknowledge before I start that a lot of this came from an article called How the UUA's Principles and Purposes Were Shaped and How They've Shaped Unitarian Universalism. A very catchy and snappy title, but it is accurate. It sums it all up very nicely. It's by Warren R. Ross, and this was back in the November-December 2000 issue of UU World. And so I want to read a quote from this article to begin. There are few issues concerning Unitarian Universalism on which UUs can agree with one another. We are a denomination, that is a single religious entity, or are we merely an association of independent congregations? Is the congregation's independence, what we call congregational polity, a sacrosanct principle, or must it yield to our commitment to racial justice? Do we call the places where we gather? Do we call them churches? Or do we call them meeting halls? Do we even worship? These are all perennial subjects for debate, but few questions cause us as much discomfort as what to say when we are asked, what do UUs believe? After all, we don't all believe the same thing. But even as we vehemently reject any creed, we seem to be forever searching for some verbal formula about which all, or at least most of us, can say, yes, that's what I, more or less, believe. And so that's the principles. These principles function in several ways, but not as a creed. I'll emphasize that a lot. It's not a creed. It's not something you, as an individual, are put on the spot when you come up and sign the membership book and say, do you swear to affirm and uphold these 7 principles? Do you believe these 7 principles? We don't do that to you. That defies your individual search for truth and meaning. But it does have reasons for existence. First of all, it is in our covenant, the covenant of all the congregations who have come together under this unifying banner of Unitarian Universalism, and we covenant to work towards these ends. It is also important in our curriculum development. Time and again, curriculums are developed around these 7 principles. And finally, Beacon Press, which is a Unitarian Universalist publishing company, now has a procedure whereby, and I'm going to read this to you, Wendy Strawtham, director of the press, started requiring that her editors include with every editorial proposal a statement explaining how the proposed volume would support one or more of the UUA principles and purposes, a policy still maintained by her successor, Helen Atwan. And then back in 1979, the Reverend Eugene Pickett, who was the president of the UUA at the time, said this: the deeper malaise lies in our confusion as to what word we have to spread. What word do we have to spread? And so the principles are designed to be the word that we have to spread. So here's the history. It began in 1961 when the Unitarians and Universalists merged, and these 7 principles are actually in our bylaws. That's where they come from. So they are in the Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws. These original principles were agreed to after much debate. And there were 2 phrases that were very controversial. The first phrase, which is not in these principles, was an old phrase that said love to God and love to man. And the humanists, because humanism was a big driving factor in the merger, and it was a predominant philosophy at the time, decided we weren't going to reference God in these principles. And the second phrase was our Judeo-Christian heritage. Now at the time, other traditions were starting to become important also, and that word "our" was changed to "the." That little change from "our," meaning it belongs to all of us, to "the," acknowledging that it did exist and was important, but might not necessarily belong to each and every one of us. Those 2 changes were made. The first one was eliminated, the second one was changed from "our" to "the," and it was accepted. These are the original principles in 1961. I'm not going to read them all off to you, but I'm going to go through some of these individually in the coming slides. And if you want to look at this later, I'll put it back up. But originally there were 6 principles, not 7. Oh. And I hit way too many keys. Okay. In 1979, the original principles had to come up for a review. Eugene Pickett, the man I just read from, called for an update to our principles. He said, again, referring to the principles as the word that we have to spread, the old watchwords of liberalism, freedom, reason, tolerance, worthy though they may be, are simply not catching the imagination of the contemporary world. They describe a process for approaching the religious depths, but they testify to no intimate acquaintance with the depths themselves. If we are ever to speak to a new age, we must supplement our seeking with some profound religious finds. So, in essence, he's saying the principles are great, but they're not deep enough. So he called for an update to the principles, and UU women's groups were heavily involved in the new version, the version we have today. I'll see if I can click this more gently. There we go. Revisions were needed because there was a lot of sexist language that more and more the other religious traditions outside of the Judeo-Christian heritage that Unitarians and Universalists came up from were becoming more and more important and had to be acknowledged. And finally, there was nothing in the old principles about concern for our environment, and that we wanted to add that. So now we're going to play a game. Specific changes that were made, or can you spot the issues? I'm going to put the old and the new together, and you can look at it and see if you find out what it was that had to be changed. First of all, worth and dignity. The top version is what we have today, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. In 1961, it read, to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships. Now that last part, the democratic method, we've included, but in a different principle. So you all just take a look at that and see if you can figure out what might have been objectionable. And if you didn't know, there it is. The dignity of man, because of course it's men that matter. Hard to believe in 1961 we were still doing that. You would have thought. But anyway, they finally did acknowledge, only about half of the people on earth are men. Why don't we include everybody? Truth and meaning. Today we say a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. In 1961 we say, to strengthen one another in a free and disciplined search for truth is the foundation of our religious fellowship. That one's a little tougher. What's with the wording there that might bother people?
Atheists would like religious.
Maybe. Well, let's take a look at what Doug came up with.
Yeah.
2 words. First, and actually, there could be a third, and I'll get to that in a second. First of all, disciplined might turn off some people because it sounds like we're going to enforce rules on you. We're going to have catechisms. We're going to have creeds. We have to make this disciplined. And secondly, the very word religious was still controversial back then. And are we actually a religion, or are we a movement? Are we an association? Does religious imply God? The third word, which didn't even occur to me, and it came up in my reading, is the word fellowship, because it's a group of fellows. I never thought of that as a sexist word, and yet it turns out it is also, and that's one that I have never considered until I did the research for this. The sources. Now, we have a separate group, which I covered last Sunday, the sources of the living tradition. Back then, they were part of the principles. To cherish and spread this is the old version, to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage. That's where the word "are" was eliminated, by the way, and changed to "the." Summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. This entire thing was removed from the principles and added to the sources, and a bunch of other sources were listed to cover all the religions and philosophies of humankind, at least in general terms. So this left the principles and became part of sources of the living tradition. And so there's the words I was showing you. First of all, "the" was changed, and secondly, once again, we have love to God and love to man. So we have to get rid of the sexist language there also. Spiritual growth. To serve the old version, to serve the needs of member churches and fellowships, to organize new churches and fellowships, and to extend and strengthen liberal religion. And today it just says acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. So you can see a lot of words were changed. I already covered fellowship. Got rid of churches because that has a definite Christian flavor. Also got rid of the phrase, now here's the one, and I might as well click on to the next one, liberal religion. Now in 1961, liberal religion had a much different meaning than it would today if you said it. Liberal religion meant progressive thought. It meant social gospel, the idea that we have to take care of people, that that's far more important than what you believe. We almost became the church of liberal religion. There were variations of that name being bandied about when we unified, as opposed to the 10-syllable Unitarian Universalist, which is a mouthful, and now, unfortunately, we call ourselves UUs, which means there's a bunch of little lambs running around, apparently. But, yeah, I know. I do not like, I do it, I say it, I don't like it. It's just But it almost became something else entirely. There was a lot of push to include the phrase liberal religion in a title describing this new merged organization. But instead, by 79, liberal had become a much more politicized term probably, and was also being used by the conservatives to attack, as an attack phrase, that liberal religion equated to apostasy, falling away from the true faith. And in 1979, I lived in that world, the conservative Christian world, and liberal was essentially a profanity when referring to religion. So they got rid of that phrase also. So, in 1981, a non-sexist revision was presented to the General Assembly. A committee was established to study the issue, and so out of this came this proposal to create the 5 sources of the living tradition, and then the 6th, the earth-centered traditions, was added 10 years later, or 14 years later, in 1995. Now, to update your bylaws, because that's what we're doing here, you're not just voting on principles, you're voting to change bylaws of the UUA. You have to have 2 votes at 2 general assemblies. So in 1984, it passed, and then for the second and final vote in 1985, it passed with only 1 no vote. So it was just almost unanimous. And so That was changed, and those are the principles we have today. Now, our current bylaws require that the principles and sources have to be reviewed every 15 years. Remember, these are bylaws that are being reviewed. No church, by the way, has to do anything with these. The principles and the sources are in the bylaws, but an individual UU congregation doesn't have to include them in their brochures or on their website or talk about them at all. They do because they're important, but it's not a requirement. There was another attempt to revise the principles in 2009. There was a proposal to replace the 7 principles with a much longer version, and again, this is going to be a change to the bylaws, and it was defeated barely, 573 to 586. Now, I struggled to find a copy of this on the internet, and all the references to it are gone, mainly because it was voted down, I guess, but I did find a copy of them in an old copy of UU World Magazine, which I actually have down here, and I'll put it out so if you want to see it. It's much longer. It's actually 5 full paragraphs that are being added. One of the paragraphs still includes the 7 principles. Another one talks about the sources, and then there's a lot more added. And people generally felt it was too wordy, too long, not poetic enough. There were various arguments against it. Not that the words themselves were bad, but that they wanted something shorter and in list format, essentially. So it had sort of a more poetic, or dare I say, more creed-like format. I'm not sure. Everyone had a different feeling on it, enough that it was voted down, and therefore there was no vote the following year. If it had been voted yes on, they would have had the vote the following year again, get another yes vote before those bylaws would have been changed. So in conclusion, the principles are a living document. They are going to be reviewed no less than every 15 years. And remember that the principles are part of the bylaws for the UUA, Unitarian Universalist Association. They don't have to be part of the bylaws of any individual congregation. But they do spell out how we as congregations hope to function together. That's the point of them. Not to maybe become an individual creed for each person in our congregation. They are designed to be meaningful, but they're also designed to be somewhat general to allow for individual interpretation. You may not agree with one of them, or you may not agree with a certain interpretation of one of them, and you are allowed that freedom. That's the way it is here. They are not a creed, and they should never be used as such. No one ever swears or affirms to uphold them. Nonetheless, they are very valuable. They drive how our association functions, and the principles are absolutely critical, I think, in how each congregation should function also. That being said, since it's been a tough week, next week we're going to have puppies! Somehow I am going to incorporate dogs into a sermon with lots of pictures, because I talk about my dogs a lot, and most of you have never seen them. And also, there are actually some practical applications and principles of how dogs, at least in my life, have been a part of my spiritual development. And doggone it, after this week, we are going to have cute dog pictures. So, with that, thank you so much for coming out on a cold, miserable day, and look forward to the